The morning Mabel Easton walked into the Harlan County livestock auction with nothing but $47 folded inside her boot, and the kind of quiet fury that only a woman who has buried a husband and watched the bank circle her land like a vulture can carry. Every man in that dusty yard turned to look at her, and not a single one of them believed she was dangerous. She was 32 years old, brown-haired and sun-browned, with green eyes that had long since stopped being soft about anything, and she wore a dress that had been washed so many times the blue had faded nearly to the color of winter sky. Her boots were good, the one thing she had refused to let go to ruin, and her chin was up in that particular way that women in hard country learned to carry themselves when the world expected them to fold. Behind her, the auction yard smelled of horse sweat and sawdust, and the kind of money that accumulates in the hands of men who were already rich before they arrived. And Mabel walked through it all like she owned the ground beneath her feet, rather than having just received the 4th letter from Harlan County Savings and Loan informing her that the mortgage on the Easton homestead was 60 days past due. It was the spring of 1881 in the territory of Kansas, and the town of Caldwell was the kind of place that existed at the edge of everything important. The cattle drives still moved through, though the great days of the Kishom Trail were winding down as the railroads pushed further west and the land got fenced in ways it had never been fenced before. Caldwell sat near the Kansas Indian Territory border, loud and dusty and full of men making deals. And it was the kind of town that had more saloons than churches, more hope than sense, and more stories than it could ever hold. Mabel had driven herself in from the Easton property, 7 miles east, in a wagon that needed new wheel bearings and was pulled by a single-dun mare named Charlotte, who was the last animal she owned. The $47 in her boot was the sum total of what she had earned from taking in laundry for 3 months, and she had a plan that most people who knew her would have called insane, and that she herself was aware was a long shot, but which was the only plan available given the circumstances. She was going to buy something at this auction that would turn things around. The question was what? She found a place along the fence rail where the other observers stood, mostly men in their good hats who had come to watch money change hands, and she took out the folded sheet of paper she had written her notes on the night before by candlelight while her daughter Clara slept in the back room. Clara was 8 years old and had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and she was currently staying with Mrs. Hollies in town, who kept children sometimes for a small fee, which meant Mabel had exactly the length of this auction day to change the direction of their lives. She studied her notes. The auction today included several lots of cattle, some farm equipment, 2 horses, and one item that had caught her eye in the printed broadsheet that the auction house posted on the wall of the general store each month. Listed near the bottom in small type was a single entry that read, Lot 47, 40 acres unimproved land, border of Indian Territory with water rights and existing well. Starting bid $20, 40 acres, a well, water rights. In a territory where water was the difference between everything and nothing. The land was unimproved, which was why nobody wanted it. No house, no barn, no fencing, nothing broken in. It sat right at the edge of the Indian Territory line, which made most buyers nervous, though relations in this particular stretch of the territory had been more complicated than outright hostile for some years, particularly since the various agreements and the establishment of farming communities among the 5 civilized tribes to the south. Still, men who had money preferred land with houses already on it, land closer to town, land that came already tamed. Mabel Easton looked at Lot 47 the way a woman who has nothing looks at something that might become everything. She folded her paper back up and watched the auction begin. The auctioneer was a heavy-set man named Burl Connors, who had the voice of a man who had been talking loudly in open air for 30 years, and he moved through the early lots with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that the money came in waves, and you had to work the crowd to keep it rolling. Cattle went for decent prices. A pair of matched Belgian draft horses went to a rancher named Calhoun for a price that made people nod appreciatively. Farm equipment was picked over by farmers who examined it with the particular suspicion of men who knew that equipment at auction had usually already broken somebody's heart. Mabel watched all of this and said nothing, and attracted several curious glances from the men around her, because a woman alone at the Caldwell livestock auction was not common, and a woman alone who was studying everything with those green eyes and that set jaw was even less common. A few of them she knew by sight. Most she did not. She kept her attention on the auctioneer. She was somewhere in the middle of calculating how much money she might have left after the bid when she became aware that someone had come to stand at the fence rail not far from her, and that this person was also looking at the auction sheet rather than the current bidding, which meant they were also looking ahead. She did not look at him directly. She watched the corner of her vision. He was tall, which registered first. Broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who did physical work regularly rather than the way of a man who simply ate well. He wore a hat that had seen weather and survived it, dark brown, pushed back slightly on his head in the way that suggested he had been wearing it for years and had it shaped to his particular skull. His coat was clean but not new. His boots were work boots, not town boots. His hands, which rested on the fence rail, were large and calloused, and had a recent cut across the back of the left one that was healed but still pink. He was looking at the auction sheet with the same focused attention she was giving it, and after a moment she saw his eyes travel to the bottom of the list, to lot 47. She looked away and thought several things in rapid succession. First, that this was a complication. Second, that she had $47, which was $27 more than the opening bid, which meant she had some room but not unlimited room. Third, that this man looked like someone who might have more than $47. She was still processing this when he spoke, not turning to look at her but addressing the fence rail in a conversational tone, as though continuing a discussion they had not started. "You are looking at lot 47, he said. His voice was low and had a slight roughness to it, the kind that comes from spending more time outdoors than in, and it had just the faint edge of something that was not quite a southern accent but was adjacent to it, the way speech picks up color from the places a person has lived. "I was looking at the whole sheet," Mabel said, also addressing the fence rail. "You stopped at 47. So did you." There was a brief silence in which the auctioneer sold a hay baler to someone with enthusiasm, and the crowd made the sounds crowds make when money changes hands. "Matthew Sullivan," the man said, and extended his hand along the rail in her direction without turning. She looked at it for a moment and then took it. His grip was firm and brief and respectful. "Mabel Easton," she said. Now he did turn, and she allowed herself to look at him fully. He was perhaps 36 or 38, with a face that weather had worked over honestly, a strong jaw with 2 days of dark stubble on it, and eyes that were the particular amber brown of creek water in late summer, clear and direct. He had a good face. Not a pretty face, but an honest one, the kind of face you find yourself trusting before you have had the opportunity to think about whether you should. "You thinking about bidding on 47, he asked, and his tone was curious rather than challenging. "I am," Mabel said. Something passed through his expression. Not amusement exactly, though there was something near it mixed with what might have been respect or might have been calculation. She couldn't tell yet. "So am I," he said. "Then we will see who wants it more," Mabel said, and turned back to the auction. Matthew Sullivan was quiet for a moment, and then he let out a short breath that was almost a laugh, and he also turned back to the auction, and they stood there side by side at the fence rail in the spring Kansas sunshine, and waited for lot 47. Matthew Sullivan had come to Caldwell from Colorado 3 months earlier, with $300 saved from 5 years of working as a trail hand on cattle drives up and down the Kishom and Western trails, and a very specific intention. He was done driving cattle for other men. He had ridden the trail from Texas to Kansas and back more times than he could count easily, had seen enough of other men's cattle and other men's profits and other men's land to know with bone-deep certainty that he wanted land of his own. Not a big operation, a real one, something that would last. He had looked at several parcels in and around Caldwell, and most of them were either too expensive or too picked over, and Lot 47 had appeared on the auction sheet like an answer to a question he had been asking for years. 40 acres with water rights and a good well, right at the border of the territory. He had ridden out to look at it 2 weeks ago, and the land was better than the description suggested. The well was deep and good. The soil along the creek bottom was rich. The 40 acres included a rise that would shelter a house from the north wind. It was unimproved, but it was not unworkable, and a man with strong hands and enough stubbornness could turn it into something real within a few seasons. He had $412 in his pocket. He intended to buy the land for as close to $20 as the bidding would allow, and use the rest to build with. He had not expected a woman to be standing at the fence rail planning the same purchase. He watched the auction progress toward Lot 47 and found himself watching Mabel Easton in the way you watch something unexpected and interesting, not rudely but honestly. She was watching the auctioneer with the composed attention of someone who was not nervous, or at least not showing it, and there was something about that composure that he found himself wanting to understand. A woman alone at a livestock auction was not nothing. A woman alone at a livestock auction with her eye on a land parcel at the edge of the territory and no man beside her was a story he did not know yet. He was, by nature, a man who found stories interesting. The auctioneer reached Lot 47 as the afternoon sun was beginning its tilt toward the west, and he read out the description with somewhat less enthusiasm than he had applied to the cattle and horses, because unimproved land at the territory border was not the kind of thing that drove bidding wars, and Burl Connors was a man who saved his energy for the lots that deserved it. Lot 47, 40 acres, unimproved, border of the Indian Territory, water rights included, existing well on the property, survey on file with the county. Starting bid $20. The crowd was thin by this point, the men with money already having spent it on the things they had come for. Mabel said, $20, in a clear, firm voice, and the slight rustle that moved through the remaining crowd was the sound of men being surprised. The auctioneer looked at her. $20 bid, do I have 25? Matthew said, 25, and Mabel looked at him sideways with an expression that was not quite a glare but was in that neighborhood. 25 bid, do I have 30? 30, Mabel said. 35, Matthew said. She turned to look at him properly now, and he met her eyes with an expression that was entirely serious and also, somewhere behind it, something she could not quite name. 40, she said. He paused, just a half second, but she registered it. 45, he said. She had $47. She needed 2 of them to get Charlotte properly fed on the way home and to pay Mrs. Hollies for watching Clara. The auctioneer was watching with the interest of a man who had just realized something more interesting than usual was happening. 45 bid, do I have 50? Mabel Easton stood very still at the fence rail and looked at the auctioneer and then at Matthew Sullivan and then at the auctioneer again, and the silence stretched for 5 full seconds, which is a long time when a life is pivoting. Are you all in at 45? The auctioneer asked, looking at her, and his voice was not unkind. I have $47, Mabel said, and she said it quietly and without apology, the way you state a fact that is true regardless of whether you would prefer otherwise. I will bid 47. The crowd went completely still. Matthew Sullivan turned fully toward her and looked at her with those amber eyes, and something happened in his expression that she could not quite read, a kind of shifting like weather changing. 47, he said. Do I have 50? Another silence. Mabel's jaw was set hard, her eyes forward, waiting. Matthew Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, and then he did a thing that surprised everyone in the yard, including himself. No, he said, and he said it to the auctioneer. I don't have 50, I mean I have 50, but I'm done bidding. The auctioneer blinked. "Are you withdrawing your bid?" "The lady bid 47 and I'm done at 45, Matthew said. 47 takes it." "That is not how bidding works," the auctioneer said, though not unkindly, the way a man explains a rule he himself finds inconvenient. "It works how the people in it decide it works," Matthew said, with a reasonableness that was somehow harder to argue with than anger would have been. "I'm done at 45. She bid 47. That's the high bid." Mabel turned and looked at him, and her expression was not gratitude, not yet, because she was not entirely sure what this was, and she had not survived 2 years of widowhood by being careless about people's motives. "Why?" she said. "Because you said you had $47, he said, "and you bid all of it." "That is not an answer to the question I asked." "It is the only answer that is true right now," he said. "The others might come later." The auctioneer, who had been watching this exchange with the fascinated attention of a man watching two people discover something they didn't expect, cleared his throat and brought down his hammer. "Sold lot 47, 40 acres with water rights, to the lady for $47. Ma'am, you will need to settle with the office." Mabel Easton paid $47 for 40 acres of Kansas land and water rights and a good deep well, and she walked out of that auction with exactly nothing in her boot, and the deed receipt folded carefully in her hand, and she felt something she had not felt in 2 years, which was the specific terror and exhilaration of having done something that could not be undone. Matthew Sullivan walked out behind her, and he fell into step beside her without asking permission, and she led him because she had not yet decided what she thought about him, but she was in no hurry to decide. "You had enough money to outbid me," she said as they crossed the auction yard. "Yes," he agreed. "So you chose not to." "That's right." She stopped and faced him, squinting slightly in the late afternoon sun. "Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate the gesture, but I am not a charity case, and I am not in the market for a man to feel sorry for me." "I don't feel sorry for you," he said, and his tone was entirely matter-of-fact. "A woman who drives herself to a livestock auction with $47 and bids all of it on land at the territory border is not someone I feel sorry for. I find her interesting. There is a difference." She studied him for a moment. The sun was in her eyes. Charlotte was tied at the rail near the street, waiting patiently. Mrs. Hollies would want her fee by supper time. "I have to collect my daughter," Mabel said. "All right," he said. "And I have to figure out how I am going to build anything on 40 acres with no money." "That is a problem," he agreed, "but it is my problem." "Yes, ma'am." She turned back toward the street and he walked with her, and when they reached the rail where Charlotte was tied, she untied the mare and turned back to find him standing there with his hat in his hand, which was the posture of a man who has something more to say and is not sure yet if he has the right to say it. "What?" she said. "I'm going to be looking for work," he said. "Cattle driving is done for me. I have some carpentry skill and I know land. I'm not asking for anything. But if you are going to build on that property, and you need a hand who works for fair wages and keeps his word, I know this territory." She looked at him for a long moment, this tall man with the honest face and the amber eyes and the 2 days of stubble and the hat he was holding like he was in someone's parlor. "I cannot pay you," she said. "Not right now. I know that. This is not a charity arrangement either. If I cannot pay you eventually, I will not ask you to work for me. I understand that. Then why would you offer?" He put his hat back on and looked at her with that direct gaze. "Because I was going to build something on that land, and now you have it. And I think you're going to build something on it anyway. And I would rather be part of something being built than stand here watching it happen and wondering." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to Mabel Easton in a very long time, and she felt it in a way she had not expected to feel anything, in the space behind her breastbone where she had been keeping herself carefully sealed since the day she buried Thomas. "My daughter is 8 years old," she said. "Her name is Clara. She is a good girl, but she does not always take to strangers." "I am good with children," he said. "We will see about that," Mabel said, and she climbed up onto the wagon seat with the deed receipt folded in her hand, and Charlotte shifted and blew and was ready. The Easton property is 7 miles east. You can come out tomorrow morning if you like, and we will see what kind of work you actually know how to do. Yes, ma'am, he said, and she thought there was something in the edge of his mouth that was close to a smile, though he kept it contained. She drove to Mrs. Hollis's house on the east end of Caldwell and paid the woman her fee from the coins she had kept out of the boot, which left her with exactly 73 cents, and she collected Clara, who came out in a rush of dark braids and dusty skirts, and launched herself at her mother's waist with the wholehearted physicality of a child who has been good all day and is done being good. "Did you do it?" Clara demanded, looking up. "Did you buy something?" "I bought land," Mabel said, and her voice, saying it out loud for the first time to someone who mattered, carried something she could not quite disguise. "Land," Clara repeated, tasting the word. "Is it good land?" "It is going to be," Mabel said. She drove them home in the early evening with the Kansas sky going gold and red behind them, and Clara tucked against her side on the wagon seat asking questions about the land. And Mabel answered them all as truthfully as she could, and she did not mention Matthew Sullivan, because she did not know yet what there was to say about Matthew Sullivan, only that he had surprised her, and she was not easily surprised. The Easton homestead was modest and worn, a one-room house with a lean-to kitchen that Thomas had built the first year, a small barn that needed work on its west wall, and fields that had been planted with wheat 2 seasons, running with results that had been disappointing, and then devastating. Thomas had died of a fever in the winter of 1879, when Clara was 6, and Mabel had kept the homestead going for 2 years through a combination of stubbornness and desperation, taking in laundry and mending, trying and failing to keep the wheat crop viable, watching the mortgage payments fall behind in a way that felt inevitable and still felt terrible. She had not been defeated, but she had been close enough to it to understand what it felt like, and that understanding had driven her to the auction with $47 and a plan that most sensible people would have questioned. Now she had 40 acres and a well and no money, and a tall cowboy who had voluntarily lost a bidding war coming to her door in the morning. And she lay in the dark that night listening to Clara breathe in her sleep and thinking about water rights, about what could be grown with reliable water, about how a woman with no cattle and no real crop experience might build something on 40 acres if she had the right help. Matthew Sullivan arrived at the Easton property at 7 in the morning, as the day was still cool, riding a solid bay gelding named Drum that had the patient eyes of a horse that had been well treated. He came with tools in his saddlebags, a good hammer and various bits and pieces, and he came with a paper-wrapped parcel that he handed to Mabel without comment when she opened the door, and which turned out to contain a pound of cornmeal and some dried beans, because he was a man who understood that someone who had spent their last $47 on land might be short on provisions, and he had bought it from his own pocket without making anything of it. Mabel looked at the parcel and then at him and said, "I will pay you back for this." "When you can," he said easily, and looked over her shoulder at Clara, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with her dark eyes wide and evaluating. "This is my daughter, Clara," Mabel said. "Clara, this is Mr. Sullivan, who is going to help us for a time." Clara looked at him with the frank suspicion of a child who has learned that strangers' good intentions are worth examining. "Do you know how to fix fences?" She said, "I do," Matthew said. "We have a fence down on the east side and Mama has been meaning to fix it." "Clara," Mabel said. "She has," Clara said, unrepentantly factual. "I can take a look at it," Matthew said, with perfect gravity, as though the 8-year-old were a business partner raising a legitimate concern. Clara looked at him for another moment and then stepped aside from the doorway in a gesture that clearly constituted acceptance, and Matthew Sullivan's mouth did the thing again where it was almost a smile. They spent the first day in a way that was entirely practical and completely exhausting. Matthew looked at the barn and made a list of what needed doing. He fixed the east fence using materials from the barn's scrap pile. He looked over Charlotte with the thoroughness of a man who knows horses, adjusted her harness fittings, and told Mabel that the mare needed better feed and was good for another 10 years if treated properly, which was comforting. He did not overstep. He did not take charge in ways she had not invited. He asked before he did things, described what he was doing and why. And when she had opinions, he listened to them with the attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what she thought, which was different from the attention of men who listened to a woman, and then do what they were going to do anyway. By evening, Mabel was tired in the good way, the productive way, and she made cornmeal porridge with some salt pork she had been hoarding, and she fed Clara and Matthew at the small kitchen table as the evening came down, and the conversation was quiet and easy in the way of people who have worked hard together and don't need to perform anything. "Tell me about Lot 47, she said over the porridge. "You rode out there before the auction." "I did," he said. "The well is good. It's deep, which means it'll hold through the dry months. There is a creek that runs along the east edge of the property, and the creek bottom soil is rich, that dark loam soil that grows anything. The rise in the northwest corner of the property would shelter a house well. The rest of the land is grassland and scrub, but it's workable. You could run a small cattle operation on it, or you could put in crops along the creek bottom and use the grass for a few animals." "I don't have money for cattle," Mabel said. "Not yet," he said. "You keep saying things like that. Not yet, like you expect things to change." He looked at her over the table. Clara had fallen half asleep in her chair, which is what Clara did when she had burned enough energy for 3 adults and the day was finally over. "Don't you?" he said. She thought about the deed receipt she had folded and put in the small box on the mantelpiece where she kept the things that mattered. "I intend for them to," she said. "That is different from expecting them to, but it's a better foundation," he said, and she looked at him and found him looking back, and the candlelight was between them, and outside, the wind was doing its eternal Kansas thing, moving across the flat land with no particular destination, and Mabel felt that sealed place behind her breastbone do something it had not done in a long time. It creaked open, just slightly, the way a door opens when the air changes. She looked away and addressed the subject of the creek bottom soil, and they talked about crops until Clara slid fully off her chair and had to be caught and carried to bed, which Matthew did without being asked, lifting the child with the practiced ease of someone who had been around children, and Clara made the small boneless sounds of a deeply sleeping 8-year-old and did not wake. And he laid her in her bed with a care that Mabel watched from the doorway, and felt in that cracked open place behind her breastbone. He left at dusk and said he would come back the next morning, and she stood at the door watching him ride drum down the wagon track in the last light of the day, and thought about the nature of surprising things. In the weeks that followed, the shape of something new began to emerge from the hard Kansas ground. Matthew came every morning, sometimes bringing small provisions that he worked into the supplies without comment, and they fell into a rhythm that was entirely professional and increasingly comfortable. He began work on the 40 acres clearing scrub from the creek bottom with Mabel working beside him, because she was not a woman who directed other people's labor from a distance, and the work went faster with two. He was, as he had said, skilled. He knew carpentry, not finished parlor carpentry, but the solid structural kind that builds barns and houses that stand for generations. He knew land, could read soil and drainage and aspect with the accuracy of someone who had been paying attention to land for years, and had the particular love for it that drives real observation. He knew cattle, which would matter later, and he knew this part of Kansas in the specific way of a man who had ridden through it many times as a trail hand, and had been noting and remembering it with the eye of a man who intended to come back. Clara took to him in increments. First she watched. Then she began producing small tests, questions about horses, requests to identify this cloud formation or that bird, opportunities for him to demonstrate competence in the areas she had designated important. He passed all of them with patient good humor, never talking down to her, never being falsely enthusiastic, just steady and honest in a way that Clara, who had her mother's green-eyed ability to detect pretense, recognized as real. By the third week, Clara had started appearing at Matthew's elbow when he was working, offering tools, asking questions, occasionally issuing opinions about the correct way to do things that were sometimes right and sometimes magnificently wrong, and he treated both with equal seriousness, which was exactly right. Mabel watched all of this from her various vantage points around the property and felt things she was trying not to name yet, because naming things gives them weight, and she was not ready to carry that weight on top of everything else she was already carrying. But she watched his hands when he worked. And she noticed the specific way he listened to her when she talked, the quality of his attention, which was different from Thomas's attention, which had been loving but sometimes distracted, and different from any other attention she had experienced, because Matthew Sullivan listened to her the way you listen to something you find genuinely important, with all of himself. One evening in the fourth week, she made him stay for supper properly, not just the quick meal practicality of the early days, but a real supper, with a stew she had made from the vegetables beginning to come in from the kitchen garden, and some bread she had baked that morning. They sat at the table, and Clara held forth at length about a horned toad she had found behind the barn and her theories about where it had come from, and Matthew engaged with these theories in perfect seriousness, and Mabel found herself laughing, actually laughing, at something Matthew said about horned toads and their probable opinions about Kansas weather, and the sound of her own laughter surprised her so much that she covered her mouth, and then, seeing the warmth in Matthew's expression at the sound, lowered her hand. "You don't do that often enough," he said quietly across the table while Clara was engaged with her stew. "Do what?" "Laugh." She looked at her bread. "I have not had a great deal to laugh about," she said, and kept her voice even because even now, 2 years later, there were edges to things. "I know," he said. "I'm not criticizing. I'm just noting that it is a very good sound and the world is better for having more of it in it." She looked up at him and he was entirely sincere, no performance in it, just this direct and honest man saying what he thought, and she felt the cracked open place widen another inch. "You are a strange man, Matthew Sullivan," she said. "I have been told that," he said, and the almost smile was there again. The question of the 40 acres was developing into a real plan. They had cleared the creek bottom and turned the soil with a borrowed plow, and the planting of corn and sorghum was beginning to feel possible. Matthew had contacted several men he knew in Caldwell about the possibility of acquiring a small number of cattle on delayed payment. Not a loan exactly, but an arrangement common in the territory, where a rancher would provide 5 or 10 head in exchange for a share of the calves the following season, which was a practical solution to the problem of starting a cattle operation with no initial capital. There was a man in Caldwell named Hector Briggs who had made this arrangement with several homesteaders and was known to be fair about it, and Matthew went to speak with him and returned with news that Briggs was willing to discuss terms. "He wants to meet you first," Matthew told Mabel when he came back that afternoon. "Me," she said. "The property is in your name. He wants to know who he's doing business with." "He wants to know if a woman can run a cattle operation," Mabel said, and her tone was even but not bland. "Probably," Matthew said, without apology. "Men like Hector Briggs don't generally think of women as ranchers. He's going to be looking at you the way those men at the auction did, like you're a curiosity, but he's also fair, and if you make a sound case, he will see it. When can we meet him?" "Tomorrow, if you want." "Tomorrow," she said. She drove into Caldwell the next morning with Matthew riding drum alongside the wagon, and Clara at home under the supervision of the elderly widow who lived a mile down the road, and who had taken a liking to Clara, and sometimes minded her in exchange for small help with her own property. They met Hector Briggs at his ranch office on the north side of town, which was a proper office with books and ledgers on shelves and maps on the wall, because Hector Briggs was a man who ran a large operation, and ran it with the methodical attention of someone who understood that sentiment and good intentions did not make payroll. He was 60, compact, with a white mustache and sharp dark eyes, and he looked at Mabel with exactly the measuring expression she had expected. She laid out the case clearly and completely. The property, its features, the well, the water rights, the creek bottom soil, the grass acreage, what she intended to plant and when, what the cattle would add to the operation, what she knew about the calving schedule Matthew had outlined, what she would need in terms of timing on the share arrangement. She spoke without apology and without seeking his approval, the way you present facts to someone whose judgment you respect but whose permission you do not require, and Hector Briggs's expression shifted over the course of the 10-minute presentation from measuring to something closer to genuine interest. When she finished, he looked at Matthew. Matthew said nothing, which was the right thing because Mabel had not needed anything from him in those 10 minutes and he had understood that. "Sullivan," Briggs said, "you've ridden for me, twice on the Western Trail?" "3 times, Matthew said. "You're vouching for this arrangement?" "I am vouching that the land is what she says it is," Matthew said, "and that she is what she says she is." Hector Briggs looked at Mabel for another long moment. 7 head, he said. 4 cows, 2 of them with calf. 1 bull. You give me 2 calves next spring from whatever the herd produces, and we are square. Mabel extended her hand across the desk. "Done," she said. He shook it, and she thought there was something in his expression that was not quite surprise but was in that neighborhood, the look of a man who had adjusted an expectation mid-conversation, and found the adjustment unexpectedly comfortable. On the drive back, with Caldwell falling away behind them and the Kansas afternoon enormous overhead, Matthew rode alongside the wagon in silence for a while and then said, "You did well in there." "I know," Mabel said, and there was nothing arrogant in it, just the same factual directness she brought to everything. He laughed, actually laughed, a full sound that she had not heard from him before, and she turned to look at him and found him genuinely delighted, not at her expense but with her, and she felt something loosen in her chest completely unexpectedly, a warmth that rose and spread and was not entirely about cattle arrangements. She looked back at the road and Charlotte's patient ears and told herself she was getting ahead of things, which was true. But the warmth did not go away. The 7 cattle arrived at the 40-acre property, which Mabel had begun calling by the name she was turning over in her mind, the Easton Sullivan place, though she had not yet said this out loud to Matthew on a bright morning in late May. Matthew had built a basic corral on the property in the weeks prior, solid post-andrail work that would hold them, and he and Mabel and Clara stood at the fence and watched the cattle come in with the specific pleasure of watching something that had existed only in intention become real. Clara named all 7 of them within approximately 4 minutes, which Matthew accepted with grave formality, writing the names down in his small work notebook so they would not be forgotten. "You wrote them down," Clara said, looking at the notebook. "Of course," Matthew said. "These are important names. Cattle with proper names are better cattle." "That is not true," Mabel said. "It absolutely might be," he said, and Clara looked at her mother with an expression of pure triumph. In the evenings, after the work was done and Clara was in bed, Mabel and Matthew had begun to sit outside on the 2 chairs she had brought from the house, when the weather allowed, and talk. They talked about everything, which is a thing that happens between 2 people when they have spent enough time working side by side and have run out of practical things to say and discover that they would like to keep talking anyway. He told her about growing up in eastern Tennessee, the 3rd of 5 children, his father a farmer who worked good land without luck, because luck is not distributed according to work ethic or intention. He told her about coming west at 21, following the cattle drives because they paid and moved, and the movement suited the particular restlessness he had carried in those years, the sense of something still to be located. She told him about Thomas, who had been a kind man with big plans and a tendency to underestimate the difficulty of things, which was a gentle way of saying the man she loved had been optimistic to the point of practical inadequacy, and she had loved him fully and honestly, and had cried for him in the first months with the bottomless grief of someone who had lost the center of their world, and had then slowly, painfully, rebuilt a center that belonged to herself. That was the hardest part, she said, one evening in early June, with the stars coming out over the flat, dark land in their outrageous Kansas quantities. Not the grief I understood. The hard part was learning that I was enough of a center by myself, that Clara and I could hold. Matthew was quiet for a moment. "You are more than enough of a center," he said. She did not look at him. The stars were doing a great deal. "I am not looking for flattery," she said. "I know," he said. "I don't offer it." That was an observation. She looked at him then because she could not always not look at him, and he was looking at the stars with his profile quiet and steady, and she thought about how thoroughly she had become accustomed to his presence, how entirely the days had shaped themselves around him, and what it would feel like if he were not there, which was a thought she did not enjoy and had not expected to have. "Matthew," she said. "Mabel," he said, and there was something in the way he said her name that he had not said in it before, a depth of tone, a weight. She said, "What are you doing here?" He turned and looked at her, and the amber eyes were very serious. "I think you know," he said. "I want you to say it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said it plainly and without preamble, the way he did everything. "I am here because the day you bid $47 on that land, something happened that I cannot undo and don't want to. I came out here because I wanted to help you build something, and that is still true, but it has not been only that for some time. I think about you when I'm not here. I think about what you're doing and what you're thinking and whether you're all right. I think about your laugh. I think about the way you explain the water rights to Hector Briggs like they were self-evident truths. I think about you and I cannot stop, and I am not trying to." Mabel Easton sat in her chair under the enormous Kansas sky and felt the sealed place behind her breastbone, the one she had been keeping carefully closed for 2 years, open the rest of the way. "You should know," she said, keeping her voice steady, "that I have not been easy to be around. I am opinionated and direct, and I do not soften things as much as women are generally expected to." "I know," he said. "I find all of that extremely restful." She looked at him, and the edge of his mouth was doing the thing, the almost smile, and then it became a real smile fully, and it changed his face entirely, opened it, and she felt something she had been careful about for 2 years break loose from careful entirely. "Matthew Sullivan," she said. "Yes, Mabel. I think," she said slowly, "that I have been thinking about you quite a bit as well." He said nothing, just looked at her with that clear amber gaze. "Since the auction," she said, because she was going to be honest about it if she was going to say it at all. "I drove home thinking about a man I had just met, which was extremely inconvenient given that I had several hundred other things to think about. I thought about you on the ride back to town," he said. "I thought about the fact that you had just spent every dollar you owned and you had your chin up the whole time. I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "That made it more impressive, not less." They sat in the quiet dark for a moment, with the distance between their chairs and the awareness of it, and then Matthew reached out and put his hand on the arm of her chair, which was not touching her but was adjacent, an offered presence rather than a claim, and Mabel looked at his hand there, large and calloused and scarred from work, and put her own hand over it. His fingers closed around hers with a careful certainty, and they sat like that in the dark with the stars brilliant overhead and the cattle moving quietly in the distant corral and Clara asleep inside. And it was one of those moments that is entirely simple and entirely enormous at the same time. "I'm not going to rush you," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever this is, it goes at whatever pace is right." "You are a very patient man," she said. "With things that matter," he said. The summer of 1881 on the 40 acres was the kind of summer that people who work land remember for the rest of their lives, not because it was easy but because it was full. The corn went in and came up strong along the creek bottom. the good, dark soil doing exactly what Matthew had promised it would do. The sorghum filled in the drier sections. The cattle settled, and one of the cows who had come in pregnant produced a healthy male calf in July, a red and white one that Clara named Drumstick, over Matthew's gentle objection that this was perhaps not a dignified name for a bull calf, and Clara's magnificent counterargument that dignity was a human concept, and the calf clearly did not care. Matthew began on the foundation of a small house on the northwest rise, which Mabel had agreed was the right location for the reasons he had given at the auction: the shelter of the rise from the north wind, the visibility over the property, the natural drainage. He laid the stone foundation himself, with Mabel working alongside him, moving and positioning stones, and there was something in that work, the fundamental and ancient act of building the base of a house, that felt like a declaration. They did not rush what was between them, but it grew with the same reliability as the corn along the creek bottom, steadily and in the right conditions. And by midsummer it had become entirely evident to both of them and to Clara, who was 8 and practically minded, and who told her mother one morning in August in the straightforward way of a child who has formed a conclusion and sees no reason not to share it, that she thought Mr. Sullivan was going to stay. "What makes you say that?" Mabel asked from over the bread dough. "He looks at you like Charlotte looks at her grain bucket," Clara said. Mabel looked at her daughter. "That is not a romantic observation." "I am 8, Clara said. "I am doing my best." Matthew kissed Mabel for the first time on a Tuesday evening in late August, which is not the most romantic day of the week, but which was in fact perfect because it happened without planning or staging, in the moment after she had told him something funny about Clara, and he had laughed, and then looked at her with all of that attention focused entirely and said, "May I?" in a voice that was quiet and careful, and she had said yes in a voice that was equally quiet and considerably less careful. It was a brief kiss, brief but certain, the kind that carries a full statement in its restraint, and when they stepped back there was a silence between them that was different from all the previous silences, charged with something that had arrived and was not going anywhere. "Well," Mabel said. "Yes," Matthew agreed. She was trying very hard to look composed and doing a fair job of it, and he was watching her with those steady eyes and the real smile. And then she laughed, not the surprised short laugh but a full genuine one, and he pulled her back and kissed her again less briefly. The summer moved into fall with the particular magnificence of Kansas autumn, the sky going deep and wide and the light turning gold across the grass, and the harvests from the creek bottom came in better than Mabel had dared to hope. The corn was good, the sorghum was strong. She sold a portion of the grain in Caldwell, and the money was enough to buy 2 more cattle at the fall fair, young heifers both, healthy animals that the cattle operation could grow on. Matthew finished the house frame on the rise in October, working with a hired carpenter from Caldwell for the structural work and doing the rest himself. And when the walls went up and the roof went on, Mabel stood on the rise in the October wind and looked at it and felt something she could not entirely describe, a sense of something solid where there had been nothing, a sense of her own hands in the thing that was standing. She was still 7 miles from the Easton homestead, which she had not sold, which she was not yet ready to sell. The mortgage was still a problem. She had made 2 payments with the grain money, which had brought the account off the worst edge of delinquency, but there was still a long road to square with Harlan County savings and loan. One evening in late October, she and Matthew were sitting at the kitchen table at the Easton homestead, which was still technically their base of operations, while the new house on the 40 acres was being finished, with the account books open between them. Clara was doing her letters at the other end of the table. The candles were going, and outside the wind was doing its full autumn thing, and the account books were honest and not entirely cheerful. "We need to talk about the mortgage," Mabel said. "I know," Matthew said. "If the winter grain market is fair and the spring calving goes well, I think we can be current by this time next year," she said. But it depends on several things going right, and if any of them go wrong, I have money, Matthew said. She looked up. Matthew, I have $400, he said. I came here with that amount minus the provisions I bought in that first month. I have not spent it, because I have been working here and my expenses have been my own. $400 will not retire the mortgage, but it will buy us enough time that one bad season does not take the property. She was quiet for a moment. This is not a partnership arrangement, she said. You have no stake in this property. I have a very considerable stake in this property, he said, and looked at her evenly. You know what I mean, she said. I do, he said, and I am not offering it as an investment. I am offering it as a man who is. He paused and looked at Clara, who was very intently not appearing to listen while absolutely listening. I am offering it as a man who has strong feelings about the security of this household and the people in it. Papa feelings, Clara said without looking up from her letters. The silence that followed was enormous. Mabel looked at her daughter. Matthew looked at Clara. Clara looked at her letters with perfect equanimity. Clara Jane Easton, Mabel said. That is my name, Clara agreed. That is a very large statement for a person doing her letters. I am a good observer, Clara said, and finally looked up, her dark eyes going first to her mother, and then to Matthew with an expression that was, at age 8, essentially identical to her mother's measuring look. Is it wrong? Matthew looked at Mabel. Mabel looked at Matthew, and in the candlelight across the account books, with the wind outside and Clara's entirely composed 8-year-old gaze on both of them, something shifted from the possible into the certain. No, Matthew said quietly. It is not wrong. Clara nodded in the manner of a person whose hypothesis has been confirmed and went back to her letters. Mabel looked down at the account books and then looked up at Matthew, and there was nothing sealed any more behind her breastbone. Just open air and the particular terror and the particular joy of something real. You would need to ask me properly, she said. I intend to, he said, not in front of the account books. The account books are important, she said. They are, he agreed. But so is asking properly. He asked her properly on a Sunday in November, on the rise where the new house was standing, in the clear winter light with the land spread out below them and Caldwell a smudge in the western distance and the Indian Territory a haze to the south. He did not have a ring, because a ring was not something that had been available to him in the prior 48 hours without making a trip to town, and he had not wanted to wait for a trip to town. But he had a piece of braided leather he had made himself, a small tight braid of 3 colors of leather cord, which he put on her hand in place of a ring, and told her he would replace it when they went to town, if she wanted replacing. She looked at the braided leather on her hand, and said she did not want it replaced. He had asked her on one knee, which she had not expected, and he had said everything he needed to say with the directness and fullness of a man who was not performing a thing but meaning it entirely, and she had said yes with the same entirety. Clara, who had been standing approximately 20 feet away and had clearly been told to wait there by her mother, and had not moved, but also had not stopped watching, gave a single decisive nod when they turned toward her, the nod of someone whose plan had worked, and walked toward them across the rise with her arms already open. Matthew lifted her when she reached them, this serious dark-eyed girl who had decided to trust him in increments and was now fully decided, and Clara put her arms around his neck with the completeness of a child who does not do anything halfway, and he held her with one arm and Mabel with the other, and above them, the Kansas sky was enormous and cold and entirely beautiful. They were married in December in the small Methodist church in Caldwell, which was the kind of wedding that costs very little and means everything, with Hector Briggs and his wife as witnesses, and Mrs. Hollies who had minded Clara, and the elderly widow from down the road named Mrs. Cartwright, who had become something like a grandmother to Clara in the way of neighboring women who fill gaps that circumstance has left. The pastor was a young man new to Caldwell who was slightly overwhelmed by the self-possession of the bride, but performed the ceremony with proper solemnity. Mabel wore her good dress, the blue one, which she had let down the hem on, and added a collar of white cotton that she had made herself from a piece of fabric from the dry goods store. Matthew wore his good coat, and a new shirt he had bought in Caldwell, and his hat, which he removed in the church with the same automatic reverence with which he removed it anywhere that called for it. Clara wore a dress Mrs. Cartwright had helped her make from a piece of calico print, yellow with small brown flowers, and she stood up straight through the whole ceremony with the expression of a person presiding over an outcome they are fully satisfied with. When the pastor said the final words and Matthew kissed his bride for the first time as his wife, in the small warm church with the December wind throwing itself at the wooden walls outside and the witnesses watching, Mabel felt a thing she had not been sure she would ever feel again, which was the specific feeling of a future opening in front of her, not like a question or a hope, but like a door that has been swung wide, the way you want a door to be when you have had enough of narrow passages. They moved into the new house on the 40 acres in January of 1882, loading the Easton homestead's furniture and goods onto the wagon and making 3 trips across the frozen Kansas land, with Clara directing traffic and Matthew carrying things, with the efficient good humor of a man who has decided that moving furniture in January is an adventure rather than a hardship, and Mabel directing things from the new house's interior, which still smelled of fresh wood and plaster and possibility. The Easton homestead they kept, because the land was paid and the small additional acreage was useful, and because Mabel was not ready to let it go and Matthew did not press her on it. He understood that a place where someone lived and struggled and survived is not just real estate, and he had the good sense and the good heart to know that understanding this was important. The spring of 1882 was kind. The creek bottom produced a strong early planting of vegetables, and the fields were turned and seeded with corn and sorghum again, better planned than the first year, with the knowledge of what the soil could do. The cattle herd had grown. The 2 calves from the share arrangement with Briggs had been paid over as agreed, and the 2 heifers from the fall fair were developing well, and one of the original cows was showing signs of another pregnancy. Matthew had also begun taking on occasional carpentry work in Caldwell, not trail driving but skilled work that used his hands and his knowledge and paid honestly, and this additional income meant that the mortgage payments were being made, slowly and regularly, and the ledger that Mabel kept with the same precise attention she kept everything was moving in the right direction. There were difficulties, because there are always difficulties. A late spring frost came through in April and took out the early vegetable planting, and they replanted, because that is what you do. One of the young heifers turned out to have a temperament that made her difficult to manage, and Matthew spent 2 weeks working with her patiently until she settled, and Mabel watched him do this with the focused attention she brought to watching him work, which was not entirely about the heifer. A dispute arose with a neighboring homesteader named Burns about a fence line, because fence disputes are the eternal condition of adjacent landowners in the open country, and this one required 2 visits to the county surveyor and a formal resolution that cost them $11, but established the line clearly and permanently, which was worth $11. In May, Mabel told Matthew that she was expecting, and she told him in the kitchen in the morning light with her coffee cup in her hands and her eyes on him with that clear, direct look that he had learned was how she handled important things, head-on and without softening. He went very still for a moment, the way a person goes still when something they wanted but were not certain they had the right to want becomes real. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his arms around her, and she felt the full solidity of him. This man who had walked into her life at the fence rail of a livestock auction and stayed, and she put her face against his chest and let herself be held completely, which was something she did not allow herself often because she had learned to hold herself up, but which was different with him, had always been different. because with him being held did not feel like leaning on something outside herself, but like coming home to something that was already part of her. "A boy or a girl, I don't mind," he said into her hair. "We will see," she said. "Whatever we get, we are lucky," he said. "We made our luck," she said, because she believed that and it was true, but she was smiling against his chest when she said it. Clara's response to the news was a brief silence followed by the pronouncement that she wanted a brother, because she had enough experience of herself to know that she was fully adequate in the sister category, and a brother would be a more interesting balance. And this logic was so impeccable that neither Matthew nor Mabel could find any fault with it. The pregnancy moved through the summer and into fall, and Mabel worked through most of it in the same way she did everything, without excessive deference to the situation, though she allowed Matthew to take over the heavier physical work without argument, which was its own kind of concession. He managed this with perfect tact, redistributing tasks in ways that felt natural rather than protective. And if he worried, which he did, considerably, in the quiet of the nights when he lay listening to her breathe, he kept the worry in the right proportion and did not let it become a cage around her. The baby came in January of 1883, in the new house on the rise, in a snowstorm that came down on them with the total commitment of Kansas winter. And the doctor from Caldwell could not get through the drifts, and so it was Mrs. Cartwright who came, as she had come through the drifts wrapped in 3 coats and sheer determination, because she had delivered babies in worse conditions, and she was not going to let a little weather be the thing that stopped her. Matthew stayed in the house because Mabel wanted him there and asked him directly, which was not the standard arrangement but was the arrangement she wanted, and he stayed and was not in the way, which is a gift not every man has in those circumstances. The baby was a boy. He was large and loud and absolutely opinionated from his first moment in the world, and Matthew held him in the small hours of the January morning, with the snow still falling outside, and the lamp turned low and Mabel exhausted and brilliant, and looking at him from the bed, and he said the boy's name, which they had agreed on before, and his voice when he said it was rough in a way that had nothing to do with outdoors. The boy's name was Thomas Matthew Sullivan, because Mabel had wanted to give him the name of a father he would never know, and Matthew had agreed without hesitation and meant it, because a man who understood history understood that honoring it was not the same as being lost in it. Clara appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, because Clara was 9 years old and had stayed up through the whole of it and was owed a proper introduction. "Thomas," she said, examining the bundle in Matthew's arms. "He looks like a potato." "All babies look like potatoes," Mrs. Cartwright said from the chair in the corner, where she was drinking tea with the authority of a woman who had earned it. "He will improve," Matthew said. "He had better," Clara said, and came to look more closely, and her expression under the critical assessment was the expression of a girl who is more moved than she intends to let on. Spring of 1883 came early and warm, and the 40 acres were fully operational in the way that a place gets when it has been worked properly for 2 years, when the rhythms of it are known and the soil is understood, and the animals have settled into the patterns of the property. The cattle herd had grown to 14 head, a real small herd, and the arrangement with Hector Briggs had been fully settled the previous fall. The 2 promised calves delivered, and the arrangement closed cleanly, which Briggs had acknowledged with a handshake and the comment, delivered to Matthew but loudly enough for Mabel to hear, that she was the most reliable debtor he had done business with in the past decade. Mabel had accepted this as the compliment it was intended to be. The mortgage on the Easton homestead was brought current that spring, all of it, paid off in full with a combination of grain sales and cattle proceeds, and the careful accumulation of 2 years of determined accounting, and Mabel drove to the offices of Harlan County Savings and Loan with the full payment in a sealed envelope, and a composure so complete that the clerk behind the counter, who had sent 4 letters to the Easton property over the past years, informing Mrs. Easton of her delinquency, found himself slightly intimidated in a way he could not entirely explain. She brought home the paid receipt and pinned it to the wall above the mantelpiece in the new house on the rise, next to the original deed for the 40 acres, and stood in front of them for a moment with Thomas on her hip and Clara at her elbow, and felt the particular satisfaction of completed things. Matthew came in from the barn and looked at the pinned receipts and then looked at her, and she looked back at him, and he crossed the room and kissed her on the mouth in front of the children, which made Clara say honestly, in a tone of resigned tolerance, and Thomas make a sound of generalized contentment. "We are square," Mabel said, when he stepped back. "We are more than square," he said. "We are ahead." And they were. The summer of 1883 proved it. The corn was the best they had grown, the creek bottom fully productive, and Matthew had started a small side trade in carpentry work that was growing into something more substantial, because there was always work for a skilled builder in the expanding cattle towns, and he was good and known to be honest, which in the territory was worth more than almost anything else. A letter arrived from Matthew's brother in Tennessee that summer, the first direct family contact in years, asking after his situation, and Matthew replied at length, describing the property and the operation and his wife and his children, and Mabel read the draft of the letter before he sent it with his permission, and came to the part where he had written about her and had to sit down. He had written, "My wife Mabel is the most capable person I have ever known, and I mean that in the fullest possible sense, not as a testament to surprising female competence, as I know you might read it, but as the simple statement of fact that she is a person of uncommon intelligence and courage, and I am grateful every day of my life that I was at the right fence rail at the right auction at the right moment." She folded the letter very precisely and handed it back to him. "You can send it," she said. "Is it all right?" he asked. "It is exactly right," she said. The fall of 1883 brought with it the continuing changes that the whole of the Kansas Territory was experiencing: the fencing of the open range, the slowing of the cattle drives as the railheads pushed south, and the drives became shorter and less profitable, the shift from trail driving culture to settled ranching culture that was remaking the land in ways both practical and, for those who had lived on the open range, deeply felt. Caldwell was changing, becoming less the wild terminus of the trail drives and more a settled town with ambitions toward permanence. Matthew watched these changes with the particular attention of a man who had been part of the older world and had chosen the newer one before the choosing was forced on him. And he thought sometimes about the men he had ridden with, the trail hands for whom the world was narrowing, and he felt the loss of it in an honest way, while also being entirely certain he had made the right choice. He and Mabel talked about this one evening in October, after Thomas was asleep and Clara was doing her schoolwork, the conversation that two people have when they are close enough that the things under the surface are sayable. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The trail?" He thought about this honestly. "I miss the feeling of it," he said, "the size of it, the sky that big and nothing between you and it. But the trail was always a means to an end, and I have the end now." He looked at her. "I have more than the end. The cattle drives built this country," she said, "and now the country is closing in around where they ran. That is how it goes," he said. "The thing that builds a place is rarely the thing that the place becomes." "That is either very wise or very sad," Mabel said. "Both, probably," he said. "Most true things are." There was a moment of comfortable quiet, and then she said, "I have been thinking about expanding the cattle operation. If we can winter 12 more head this year, we could have a proper mid-sized operation by spring." He looked at her with the amused appreciation of a man who has accepted that his wife's mind is always running several practical calculations and would not have it otherwise. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "There are some good animals at the Calhoun Ranch that he wants to move before winter. Fair price." "How fair?" "Fair enough that I think we should look at them Friday." "Friday," she said, and put it in the ledger. They looked at the Calhoun cattle on Friday and bought 9 head, a transaction that represented both a significant expenditure and a significant statement of confidence in where they were. And Hector Briggs, who encountered them in Caldwell afterward and heard about it, bought them both coffee at the hotel dining room and said, with the satisfaction of a man whose investment in a long shot had paid clearly, that he was glad he had made the arrangement 2 years prior. "You had low expectations of me at that meeting," Mabel said, without rancor. "I had low expectations of the situation," Briggs said, which was a careful distinction and an honest one. "I have never doubted you since that meeting." "That is a diplomatic answer," she said. "I am a diplomatic man," he said, and raised his coffee cup. Winter of 1883 came and was hard, the kind of Kansas winter that comes with real intent, and they weathered it in the house on the rise, which proved exactly as well sheltered as Matthew had promised it would be. The north wind hitting the rise and breaking above and around them, while the cattle in the expanded corral below had good windbreaks and plenty of hay from the summer's cutting, and the family was warm and well and entirely together. Thomas, at nearly a year, had developed opinions about everything and the physical capacity to make them known, and the house was full of his commentary and his absolute determination to be wherever the interesting things were happening, which was everywhere Mabel and Matthew and Clara were. Clara had taken on his education with the thoroughness of a girl who considered this her personal project, teaching him the names of things, the names of the cattle, the names of the stars that she had been learning from a book Matthew had bought her in Caldwell, the difference between a barn swallow and a cliff swallow, the correct way to address a horse. Matthew watched his daughter teaching his son and felt things that had no adequate words, but that he carried in his chest like something precious and heavy at the same time. In the spring of 1884, Mabel discovered she was expecting again, and this time she told him over supper with Clara and Thomas both present, because the family was the family, and there was no keeping things from Clara in any practical sense, and Thomas would not remember but had a right to be part of things. Clara's response this time was to say that a sister would be acceptable. She had revised her position. "I will take that under consideration," Mabel said. "Tell the baby," Clara said. "I will pass the message along," Matthew said. The summer moved in its full productive way, the cattle herd now approaching 25 head, the fields producing reliably, the carpentry work in Caldwell steady and growing. Matthew had taken on a part-time assistant, a young man of 19 named Eli Whitmore, who was new to Caldwell and needed work, and had the same quality of honest attention to physical work that Matthew had noticed years ago in himself. And he was teaching him the building trade with the patient thoroughness of a man who understands that knowledge is worth passing on. The second baby came in October of 1884, a girl, who arrived with somewhat less drama than Thomas had managed and considerably more silence, looking at the world with an expression of thoughtful evaluation from her first minutes. Clara's satisfaction was complete. They named her Ruth Elizabeth Sullivan, and she was from the beginning a different kind of child than Thomas, quieter and more watchful, with Matthew's amber eyes and Mabel's particular quality of noticing everything. And she fit into the family with the ease of someone who has arrived exactly where they were supposed to be. In the fall of 1885, the Easton homestead was finally sold, 4 years after Mabel had left it effectively behind, and the sale price was fair, and the money went into the Sullivan operation with a clarity that felt like closing a door that had been standing open. Mabel stood at the property one last time before the sale was final, alone, because this was something she needed to do alone, and she said whatever she needed to say to Thomas Easton in the silence of the place where they had lived, and then she drove back to the rise and the new house and the children and Matthew, who was waiting at the fence with Thomas on his shoulders and Ruth on his arm, and Clara standing beside him with her hands in her pockets in the pose she had inherited entirely from her mother. She pulled Charlotte to a stop and climbed down from the wagon, and Matthew came and took the mare's bridle and looked at her. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. And then, more than all right, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so familiar by now that it was entirely natural, and she turned her face into his hand briefly. "Let's go in," she said. "Clara, what is in that pot? Is something burning?" "That would be your husband's attempt at supper," Clara said with dignity, turning toward the house. "I said it was an attempt," Matthew said, and handed Ruth to Mabel and swung Thomas down from his shoulders. And they all went inside together, out of the fall wind, into the warm and full and complicated and entirely real life that they had built on land that nobody else had wanted, with water rights and a good deep well and everything else they had made from nothing. The house on the rise stood solid on its stone foundation, built by a man who knew what he was doing, and inside it the lamp was going and the supper was salvageable, and the children were making the sounds that children make. And Mabel Sullivan stood in the kitchen doorway with Ruth on her hip and looked at the room and at Matthew, who was at the stove with a look of honest apology for whatever had happened with the supper, and Clara, who was already fixing it with the competence of a girl who had been watching her mother cook for 10 years, and Thomas, who was running a wooden horse along the floor with total conviction in its reality. She had been a widow with no cattle and no crop, and she had walked into the auction and bought the future, and the future had been better than the plan. She had not planned Matthew Sullivan. She had not planned the way he had stepped back from a bid he could have won, because she had said aloud that she had $47 and had bet all of it, and she had not planned what that had started. But she had been open enough at the right moment to recognize something real when it stood beside her at a fence rail and looked at the same piece of land with the same intention. The crops were good. The cattle were strong. The mortgage was paid. The children were loud and present and deeply themselves. The man who had come to her door with a pound of cornmeal and an honest face and a willingness to work was making a disaster of supper in her kitchen, and looking at her over his shoulder with a very particular expression that she had learned to read as thoroughly as she read the land or the sky or the ledger books, an expression that said, "You are the thing I was looking for before I knew what I was looking for." She crossed the kitchen and handed Ruth to him, because that was always a good trade, a baby for a cooking emergency, and took over the supper, and he stood behind her with Ruth settled against his chest, and his free hand resting at the small of Mabel's back in that easy, familiar way. And Clara kept up a running commentary on the current state of the food, and Thomas's wooden horse rode in circles around the table legs. And outside, the Kansas wind moved across the land in the ancient way it had always moved, indifferent to small human things, and the small human things went on anyway, warm and real and entirely sufficient. This was the life on the 40 acres that nobody else had wanted. This was the future she had bought for $47. This was the love that had grown in the space between a fence rail and a wide-open sky, between two people who had both looked at the same piece of unimproved land and seen the same thing, which was not what was there but what could be. Ruth fell asleep against Matthew's chest while the supper was being finished, and he carried her to her cradle with that particular quiet care, and when he came back to the kitchen Mabel looked at him over the stove with a full heart that she no longer kept sealed, because there was no longer anything to seal it against, only the open air and the wide sky and the life they had made together, day by day and deed by deed, from the ground up. "Sit down," she told him. "Supper is ready." He sat at the table with Thomas immediately climbing into his lap, and Clara took her place with the efficiency of a girl who has opinions about table arrangements. And Mabel served the supper, and they ate together in the good noise and warmth of a family that had been made from grief and courage and $47 and one man's deliberate choice to step back from a bid he could have won, and from everything that had grown from that moment like corn from rich creek-bottom soil, steadily and fully and in the right conditions. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and cold and brilliant with stars, exactly the same stars that had been there 2 years before when two people sat outside in separate chairs and found themselves reaching across the distance. The same stars that had been there the night Thomas Easton died, and the night Matthew Sullivan lay in a trail camp somewhere in the Oklahoma Territory, thinking about 40 acres and a good deep well. The same stars that had been above the auction yard when a widow with $47 in her boot stood at a fence rail and changed everything. The stars did not know this. They did not need to. The people under them did, and that was exactly enough.